All right, so picture this. It's 1943, World War II. Europe's a powder keg.
Righto.
Right in the middle of it all, you've got this tiny country, Bulgaria, trying like crazy to stay neutral.
Desperately.
They have no real army to speak of,
Nope.
thanks to those crippling penalties after World War I.
Right.
And they're surrounded by Axis powers.
Talk about pressure.
Yeah, talk about a tightrope walk. But leading them is this king, Boris III. And history kind of forgot about him.
It really did. It's remarkable how this whole story has kind of flown under the radar for so long.
It really is.
You'd think a king navigating World War II, like facing down Hitler, that'd be front page news forever.
Exactly.
But the Butterfly King podcast, that's what we're looking at today, right? They really dig deep and try to uncover why Boris has been kind of obscured by history.
And they don't just skim the surface, do they? They go deep.
No, they really...
They talk to his children, historians, even a snake venom expert.
Oh, yeah, they went all out.
They really wanted to leave no stone unturned.
And that's partly what makes it so fascinating.
Yeah.
It's not just a general overview of Bulgaria during the war.
Right.
You really get into the nitty-gritty of, Boris's dilemmas.
Yes.
His, the strategies he had to come up with.
It's true.
It's his personality, too. It really humanizes him.
It really does. And one of the things that really struck me is just how precarious Bulgaria's position was. You mentioned those World War I penalties.
Right.
Basically no military. It's like being a sitting duck in a shooting gallery.
It's vital to remember that it really limited Boris's options.
Absolutely.
He was dealt a terrible hand,
Yeah.
and he had to play it perfectly to even survive.
Okay, so let's talk about Boris himself.
Yeah.
He comes across as this multifaceted guy.
Mm-hmm.
On one hand, he really doesn't want war.
Right.
Promises to keep Bulgaria out of it.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, he's got Hitler breathing down his neck.
Absolutely.
And the Allies are watching his every move.
Every move.
It's crazy.
It's interesting how his personal interests are kind of at odds with this crazy political situation.
Totally.
He loved nature, butterflies.
Yeah, the Butterfly King.
He even wrote a whole book about them.
Really?
Yeah. And his kids, they're interviewed a lot in this podcast. They say he was just a warm and engaging dad, loved telling stories.
It's like two different versions of the same person.
Yeah.
The gentle, nature enthusiast, and then this king caught in the World War.
Right.
How do you reconcile those two?
And that's something the podcast kind of explores by highlighting the emotional toll it took on him.
Right.
You can hear it in his children's voices, the weight of his legacy, the questions that still linger about his death.
And speaking of his death, that's one of the biggest mysteries they tackle.
Oh, absolutely.
After a meeting with Hitler, Boris gets sick, dies, natural causes, foul play.
Ew.
The podcast digs into the different theories. They bring in medical experts, even that snake venom specialist, right?
It's like they're trying to solve a cold case,
I love it.
That snake venom thing is a good example of how deep they went.
Yeah.
It shows how many questions there still are about Boris's death.
Yeah.
And how it really shapes how we understand him even now.
It's true.
Was he becoming a problem for Hitler? Did someone else want him gone?
Right, exactly. It adds this whole layer of suspense.
For sure.
His own children believe he was murdered.
Yeah.
And that makes their part in the podcast even more powerful,
Absolutely.
It's not just historical facts, it's personal for them. They're looking for answers about their father.
That's powerful.
It really is. It's a reminder that history isn't just like dates and battles. It's about people.
Yeah.
And how those events affect their lives. And the legacies they're left to deal with.
It's true.
So to really get the gravity of Boris's choices, we need to understand the pressure cooker he was in. Bulgaria wanted to stay neutral.
Desperately.
But they were constantly being pulled in different directions. Geographically, they were strategic.
Oh, hugely.
They were valuable to both sides.
To both the Axis and the Allies.
And Boris knew that going head-to-head with Hitler would be suicide.
Absolutely.
So he played a clever game.
Yeah.
He delayed joining the Axis as long as he could, used diplomacy and his charm to buy time.
It's fascinating.
The podcast hosts, Becky Milligan and E.J. Kirby, they describe him as having this quiet authority.
I like that.
Yeah, not brute force.
Right.
It was more his ability to listen, observe, and then act strategically.
Smart.
That made him effective.
Very smart.
They also point out that he kept talking to both sides, hoping to eventually use that to Bulgaria's advantage.
Hoping to play them off against each other.
It's like 3D chess.
It is. Always thinking several moves ahead.
And what's amazing is that they actually went to Bulgaria,
They did.
traced his steps,
Mm-hmm.
went through archives, even found his personal diaries.
Wow.
It's like they went back in time to tell this story.
That really comes through in the podcast. It's not just listening to history, you're experiencing their investigation.
Yeah.
They even found people who knew Boris.
Really?
It adds this whole other dimension to it.
It's incredible to think how this one man, in such a crazy time, not only kept his country afloat, but did it in ways we're still discovering.
It is. And that's maybe most evident in his actions to protect Bulgaria's Jewish population.
Right.
I mean, such a stark contrast to what was happening in the rest of Europe.
Right.
But before we get into that, I think we need to understand the Holocaust a little better.
Absolutely, yeah.
The systematic persecution of the Jews under the Nazis.
Yeah, because to really grasp what Boris did, we need that context.
We need to understand just how horrific things were across Europe.
Totally.
It was a nightmare.
Yeah.
You're so right. We can't talk about Boris without talking about the Holocaust.
Millions of Jews across Europe just systematically rounded up, deported, murdered.
A genocide on a scale that's hard to even fathom.
Unimaginable.
And yet Bulgaria, even though they were allied with the Axis, it's like they were this anomaly.
Totally.
Their Jewish population actually grew during the war. How's that even possible?
It's wild, right?
It's crazy. The podcast really digs into how Boris managed that.
Yeah, and it's important to note that there are different ways to see his actions.
Okay.
Some historians say he just delayed the inevitable, that eventually Bulgarian Jews would met the same fate as others.
Right.
But you can't ignore the fact that under his rule, they were protected.
That's huge.
Just a massive departure from what the Nazis were doing everywhere else.
What's interesting to me is that Boris didn't make some big public statement of defiance.
Right.
It was more subtle.
Yeah.
He used these strategic moves to kind of undermine the Nazi agenda.
He was very clever.
The podcast talks about how he stalled implementing anti-Semitic laws.
Used bureaucracy. Appealed to Bulgaria's history of tolerance.
And that's where his understanding of Bulgarian culture really helped.
Okay.
And his ability to connect with his people.
Mm-hmm.
He made protecting Bulgarian Jews a point of national pride.
Wow.
Said that persecuting them would be dishonorable.
So smart. He turned the Nazis' own rhetoric against them.
He did.
Used nationalism as a shield.
Exactly.
And it worked, at least for a time. The podcast mentions this incredible incident where this high-ranking Nazi official shows up in Sofia
oh, yeah.
to oversee the deportation of the Jews. And Boris just confronts him.
Can you imagine?
Heron.
The tension.
I know. This king, knowing he's playing with fire,
Yeah.
standing up to the Nazis. But he argues that deporting the Jews would hurt the war effort,
Bizarre.
would damage Bulgaria's reputation. And he gets the deportation halted.
At least for a while.
It's amazing. It shows real courage.
He was willing to risk everything.
He was. And while the podcast says he wasn't always successful, there were deportations from some territories Bulgaria had annexed.
Right.
It's clear he did everything he could to protect the Jews within his own country.
He did. And those actions, they might seem small when you think about the scale of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
But they had a huge impact on thousands of Bulgarian Jews.
The podcast has interviews with survivors.
Yeah.
They talk about the fear, the uncertainty, the rumors of deportations,
Yeah.
and then the relief when they realized they weren't going to be deported.
Powerful stuff.
It really is. It's a reminder that history isn't just events.
Right.
It's the experiences of people. And in this case, it's a story of hope
Yeah.
amidst unimaginable horror.
It really shows the power of one person.
It does. But we also have to acknowledge how complex the situation was. Boris was walking a tightrope.
Constantly.
Appease Hitler, protect
Yeah.
his people. It's a tough balance. He couldn't be openly defiant. He had to be strategic.
Calculated. Like a chess master.
Exactly. And that's what makes him so fascinating.
Absolutely.
He's not a simple hero.
Right.
He made compromises, alliances that some would say were wrong. But within that web of choices, he found ways to resist,
It's inspired.
to hold onto humanity, even in the face of such cruelty.
Makes you wonder, what would we have done in his position
Right.
faced with those impossible choices?
It's a question I kept asking myself as I was listening.
Yeah.
It's easy to judge from a distance, but when you understand the pressure he was under, the consequences of defying Hitler,
Yeah.
you really appreciate the weight of those decisions.
You do. And it forces us to confront the fact that history isn't black and white.
Right.
It's full of conflicting motives, choices that aren't perfect, and unintended consequences.
So we can celebrate what Boris did to protect Bulgarian Jews.
Absolutely.
But we have to understand the difficult position he was in, the compromises he had to make, and the fact that even he couldn't shield his country from the war completely.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the biggest takeaways here.
What's that?
History is complicated. There are rarely easy answers. And to judge people from the past, we have to understand the time they lived in and the choices they had to make.
Okay, so with that understanding, let's talk about the mystery surrounding his death.
Okay.
Was it a natural illness, like the official records say, or was there something more to it?
This is where the podcast gets really interesting.
Yeah.
They explore all the theories about his death. They go into the evidence in this really gripping detail. It's like you're part of the investigation.
They really don't hold back. They talk to medical experts, historians, even that snake venom guy again, and wanted to cover everything, leave no stone unturned.
I love that.
It's amazing. And the fact that Boris's own children think he was murdered, it adds this whole personal layer to it.
It does?
They've been looking for answers for decades, trying to understand what happened to their father. It's really touching.
It is.
The podcast captures their emotion,
Yeah.
their determination. And it makes you, as a listener, invested in the outcome. You're analyzing the evidence with them, weighing the theories, trying to solve the puzzle.
It's a good puzzle, and it goes beyond Bulgaria.
Oh, yeah.
It's like this international intrigue, Nazis, Soviets, even the Allies are involved.
Wow. So this one death, it becomes this pivotal moment in World War II.
It does. Boris's death, whether it was natural or not, created this power vacuum in Bulgaria.
Yeah, you said it.
And it left them vulnerable.
To being manipulated.
Exactly. It's like a ripple effect. Him being gone changed everything, both in Bulgaria and internationally. And that's what makes this deep dive so much more than just a historical mystery.
Okay, I'm listening.
It's about understanding the impact of choices, the consequences intended or not, and how those ripple effects can shape history.
Right. And as we keep looking into this mystery, we'll see how Boris's death became this turning point for Bulgaria.
Yeah.
A chain of events that would change their fate forever and have a lasting impact on his legacy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's almost eerie to think about how Boris's death, no matter how it happened, completely changed things for Bulgaria. It's like everything he'd worked for, just gone.
Like that careful balancing act just disappeared overnight.
Exactly.
That stabilizing force that kept Bulgaria from being totally swallowed up by the Nazis. Just gone.
And it's so sad because his son, Simeon II, was just a kid,
A child.
totally unprepared to be king. The podcast has interviews with Simeon.
As an adult, looking back.
Yeah, and you can just hear the weight of it all. Losing his father, growing up in the shadow of that legacy.
It's another layer of tragedy to the whole story, isn't it?
It is. Not only did Bulgaria lose their leader at the worst possible time, but his children lost their dad.
And the world lost a man who, with all his flaws, had shown real compassion and strength.
The podcast doesn't shy away from those flaws either. They give a pretty balanced view of Boris.
Absolutely.
They acknowledge the criticisms of his alliance with the Axis,
Yeah.
but they also highlight how he pushed back against the Nazis, especially protecting the Jews.
It's an important point. It challenges the idea that in war, it's just good guys and bad guys.
Right.
Boris was operating in this gray area. He had to make tough choices, compromises that probably haunted him.
I kept thinking about that as I was listening. What's it like to lead in a situation like that? How do you survive and stay true to yourself? Boris's story doesn't have easy answers,
No.
but it makes you think.
It forces you to confront those big questions.
It does. So how's Boris remembered in Bulgaria now?
It's complicated. The podcast talks to people in Bulgaria, historians, politicians, and there's no clear consensus.
Oh, interesting.
Some people see him as a hero, a savior who protected Bulgaria.
Right.
Others say he was a collaborator, that he damaged their reputation.
It's funny how those different opinions seem to line up with people's politics now.
Absolutely.
It shows how history keeps getting reinterpreted through whatever's happening today.
It also shows that Boris is still relevant in Bulgaria. He's not some forgotten figure.
Yeah.
What he did, the choices he made, it still sparks debate. And it shapes how Bulgarians see their own past.
Now, before we wrap up, we have to talk about those attempts on Boris's life.
Oh, yeah.
The podcast gets into several of them, and it's like something out of a spy movie.
It's wild.
Secret plots, close calls.
It's amazing he survived as long as he did.
It is. Shows how good he was at navigating that Political minefield.
Yeah,
Making allies, but also some serious enemies.
powerful enemies.
Do they ever figure out who is behind it all?
Not really. They go through the evidence, the theories, but it's still a mystery. And I think that's part of what keeps people interested in Boris. There are still unanswered questions.
It's like a puzzle that might never be fully solved.
Exactly. A reminder that history isn't always neat and tidy.
There are loose ends, unanswered questions.
And that's what makes history so fascinating. It keeps us asking questions, digging deeper, challenging what we think we know.
So, for anyone listening who's hooked on this story, I highly recommend checking out the Butterfly King podcast.
It's a great
It's
liberal.
really detailed, it's thought-provoking, and it explores this leader who really defied expectations.
His legacy lives on.
It really does. It's a journey back to wartime Bulgaria. You meet these amazing characters, and it leaves you thinking about leadership, responsibility, and how people survive even the toughest times.
I think that's the biggest thing I took away from all of this.
Yeah.
History isn't just dates and facts. It's about people. People who made choices, did things, and changed the world.
Boris III, a complex figure,
Absolutely.
a tragic story.
But ultimately, I think a story of hope.
Yeah, I think so too.